Good evening, everyone. Late Night Mega here, and tonight we're playing Cruel Ultimatum Control. Alright, so, Cruel Ultimatum, a little bit of a backstory. Cruel Ultimatum is probably one of my favorite cards in Magic. At least one of my favorite cards that I never got to play in the standard environment that it was released in. I wasn't actively playing Magic at the time. Got back into Magic around Rise of the Eldrazi, but that's another story. So, Cruel Ultimatum comes out. I did see the card when it came out, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I love the text on this card. It looks like fun. That's my idea of fun, anyways. And then I saw some people playing it in Modern, a little bit of a following, and so I'm like, oh, I can play Cruel Ultimatum in Modern? Awesome. Of course, people at my local game shop told me, no, it's too expensive, it's a sorcery, 7-mana sorcery, there's no way it's even going to resolve in a Modern game, you won't live long enough to play it, Modern's a turn 4 format, blah blah blah, Grave Titan doesn't work, and then I just proved them all wrong. And have a fun time doing it. So, here's kind of the gist of it. You can see that there's a lot of strange looking cards in this deck, and I will be addressing all of them. Basically, how I built this deck, I found a couple lists within the Cruel Ultimatum deck thread that I liked, and I kind of took two different halves of the list and I jammed them together, and this is kind of where I ended up. So one list had Grave Titan, had no mass removal in the main deck. You'll see I don't have mass removal here. It had Coalition Relics, and another list had 3 Kolaghan's commands and 3 Cryptic commands, and I kind of like some of the synergy there going on with the Kolaghan's commands and the Grave Titan and the Snapcaster. And so I wanted to incorporate that as well, and I don't remember which of the lists had this setup up here with 3 Inquisitions, 3 Lightning Bolts, and 4 Serum Visions, but I saw that on one of the lists, and I'm like, yeah, I like that idea, I want to incorporate that into the deck. And someone was talking about running Remand is fine for Cruel Ultimatum, because you can have some synergy, remand stuff back to their hand, and then in the later game, and then get use out of Cruel Ultimatum's discard. So I'm like, okay, I'll run those, and of course Terminates, just kind of fell into place. The main deck of this has only changed by 2 cards since I first played it, and we're approaching like the end of summer of 2015, beginning of fall is when I started it. Played the first draft for one night, noticed a few problems. I used to have 4 Lightning Bolts in here, and 2 Electrolyzes, and no Izzet Charms. So I noticed some issues, with non-creature permanents, especially Planeswalkers, resolving in the early turns. So I wanted something that addressed that. And I also noticed a couple times I would get into the late game, and I'm trying to find a finisher. I'm trying to find like Grave Titan or a Snapcaster or a Cruel Ultimatum even. And I'm just getting like extra lands or extra something that's not really relevant in this particular matchup in my hand. And so I wanted a way to kind of filter through some of that. And I came across Izzet Charm. And so the great thing about Izzet Charm for this deck is, I replaced the 4th Lightning Bolt, the 2nd Electrolyze with it, and, I still have just as much creature removal as I had in the first draft, because it can also deal 2 damage to creatures. And, people ask me, is Izzet Charm really that good in Modern, and how often do you use all of the modes? It's very common for me to use all 3 modes within the course of a single tournament that's 4 or 5 rounds. So yeah, I use all modes very frequently. Some other nice little synergies in this deck. Remand, I love having these as a 4 of. A lot of these cards draw me extra cards. Serum Visions, or they say draw a card on it, which is really great. And Electrolyze draws me a card. Kolaghan's Command doesn't quite draw me a card, but it returns a creature from my graveyard. Cryptic Commands draw me a single card. Augur of Bolas get me another card. So a lot of cards just help cycle through this deck, and it keeps the deck moving very quickly. And so another couple other cool things about Remands. I already mentioned Remand with Cruel Ultimatum, but Remand in general, you know, a lot of times with this deck, my opponent isn't playing something that I feel like I can't deal with. A lot of times it's, I just need more time, I need to make more land drops, I need to find one of these other cards to kind of deal with it. Sometimes I remand something back to their hand just to Inquisition it out of their hand, because, well, I know Inquisition will be a valid target. I've done some interesting things with Inquisition, like using Cryptic Command to bounce something like a choke, and then Inquisition it out of their hand. So Inquisition, you know, has value throughout the game in this deck, and if it ever doesn't, you can discard it to Izzet Charm. Typically what I do when I use the discard effect, or the draw discard effect of Izzet Charm, I make sure I already have at least one card in my hand that I'm wanting to discard, whether it's an extra land or an Inquisition or something that's just not useful. Might be a Coalition Relic. We'll get to that in a little bit. Let's go to the mana base. We've got 24 lands in the deck, and you know, since I've been playing Standard for quite a while, I have play sets of Bloodstained Mire, Polluted Deltas, and Flooded Strands, all the fetch lands I would need, so Grixis colors I'm pretty well set for. So I've got 3 Bloodstained Mires, 4 Polluted Deltas, that gives me 7 fetches, and I have 4 shock lands, one of them being a Blood Crypt, 1 Watery Grave, and 2, where's my Steam Vents? There's Steam Vents. 2 Steam Vents. And then I like to run a lot of check lands. In fact, I'm running 8 check lands in this deck, 4 of them being Drowned Catacombs. I like this that this is a blue source that isn't an island, so take that, choke. 3 Dragon Skull Summits, and 1 Sulphur Falls, because I only owned 1 Sulphur Falls at the time. And you know, I really appreciate the check lands. You know, any one of these shock lands will instantly turn on all of the check lands. And so the check lands can keep coming into play. You don't lose life for playing them. It's great. And they make 2 colors. And so then we come to the basics. We've got 3 islands, 1 mountain, and 1 swamp. And so a couple things people always ask me is, well, why don't you play more lands? You know, most Cruel Ultimatum decks are running 25 to 26 lands. After all, we are trying to get to 7 mana to play this massive game-breaking sorcery. And, you know, the way I view it is Coalition Relic here. I view Coalition Relic as lands number 25 and 26. People have also asked me, well, why don't you play another spell instead of Coalition Relic? You know, another counter spell or something. And yeah, I'm like, that's not what that card slot is for. That card slot is basically lands 25 and 26. And another thing you'll note with the mana base is I'm not running any man lands. For one, I don't own any Creeping Tar Pits. I do own Wandering Fumaroles, but I still wouldn't put them in here. There's just a lot of cards at the 1 and 2 mana slot that I want my lands to be able to come in to play untapped. Untapped, no questions asked. And so Coalition Relic is basically lands 25 and 26, but they do so much work in this deck. Number 1, I always put a charge counter on it at the end of my opponent's turn. And so at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, remove all charge counters. It's only going to have 1 of them on it. And then you can add 1 mana of any color for each charge counter removed. So a lot of times I go end of turn, put a charge counter on it, even if I don't plan on using it, just put it on there anyways. And then untap, and then draw your card, and then remove the charge counter for like blue and play a Serum Visions without tapping any of your lands. And that can be really amazing, especially in control mirrors where suddenly you're playing Serum Visions, you're playing Inquisition of Kozilek for free, essentially, and not tapping your lands, saving your lands or your other blue sources for other spells. And it can be a really huge benefit. Another thing you can do is enable a turn 5 Cruel Ultimatum, which is really sweet. And the way you do that is you put a charge counter on it, you untap, you draw, you play your 5th land, remove the charge counter, usually for black because Cruel Ultimatum takes triple black. Tap your 5 lands, tap Coalition Relic, plus the charge counter, that's a total of 7 mana, and there's a turn 5 Cruel Ultimatum. It doesn't happen that often to the point where you'd want to keep Coalition Relic in just to enable turn 5 Cruel Ultimatum. When it happens, it's awesome, it's really sweet, it's a lot of fun, at least for me. But you can't count on that as a reliable winning strategy. So if you go into a match like, okay, I need to resolve a turn 5 Cruel Ultimatum in order to win this, that's not something dependable. But another thing about Coalition Relic is, unlike other lands that we could play in this slot, Coalition Relic gives us protection against Blood Moon and Choke. It still lets us cast cards underneath of that. Fun story I had, I was playing against one of those turn 1 Blood Moon decks, and you got the turn 1 Blood Moon. Of course, I was on the play, though, so I got to use my fetch land, get a basic, and then I'm like, I don't even care about Blood Moon. You can have it, because I have Coalition Relic in my hand. And I just made a complete mockery of his Blood Moon, got all of my colors. Only things I weren't really able to cast was Cryptic Command and the Cruel Ultimatum, but then a second Coalition Relic enabled me to cast Cruel Ultimatum, well, at least the counter target spell, getting triple blue on your opponent's turn with a Coalition Relic under a Blood Moon. Not the easiest thing to do. Getting it on your turn you can, because you can get 2 blue out of the Relic on your turn. But with a second Coalition Relic on the field, really late into the game, I was able to even cast Cruel Ultimatum under a Blood Moon. And that was just all kinds of silly. So Coalition Relic gives you protection against cards like that, and also just kind of freaks your opponent out. There's several really weird cards in this deck. The Izzet Charms, the Relics, and this Augur Bolas that I still have to talk about. And your opponent starts seeing some of these cards, they might think you have no idea what you're even doing, playing stuff like this in Modern. And you just kind of freak them out. And sometimes I'll even, at the end of the turn, I always put the charge counter on. If I untap, draw, and figure out that, okay, I'm not going to use the mana from the Relic that turn, I'll say, okay, I'm going to add a white mana, and then my opponent's just looking at me. If they don't know me very well or don't know this deck very well, they're just like, I don't have a clue what in the world's going on, and it just kind of freaks them out. It's funny. It amuses me. I get amused by a lot of things that I do with some of these decks. Alright, elephant in the room time. Let's talk about Augur of Bolas. So, a funny story about this. This card wasn't even supposed to be in the deck to begin with. This card was supposed to be 2 Jace Vern's Prodigy, the flip Jace, and what had happened was I'd been playing my blue-white Shadow of Doubt deck for a while now, at least a month and a half, probably close to 2 months. And I'm playing it on the Tuesday night Moderns. I'm still playing Standard on Friday nights at this point in time. And one of my friends, he's going to an out-of-town Standard event for the weekend. And he asked me to borrow his Jace. We've loaned each other cards before, and so I'm like, yeah, I know, I trust you. Here's my 3 Jaces. And so he's borrowing them. Meanwhile, I spent hours earlier in the week drafting up this deck list, and there's supposed to be 2 Jaces in it. And I'm like, well, I'm not running Jace currently in my Standard deck, so yeah, of course my friend can borrow them. And he'll get them back to me next Friday night. So Tuesday rolls around, And I'm like, okay, I'm ready to go to the Tuesday night tournament. I'm going through my deck, and I see the checklist cards for Jason, and I'm like, oh, PG channel. And I start panicking. I'm like, I loaned my Jaces to my friend. He still has them. I'm not getting them back till Friday. What am I going to do? I thought about, just grabbing my blue-white control deck and going with that, but I've been playing that deck for a while, and plus I drafted up this deck list. I wanted to play Cruel Ultimatum. I was excited to finally be able to play this card, and now I don't have Jace. So I'm like, and I only own 2 Snapcaster Mages. Most lists I see online run 4. I only own 2, so I can only use 2. So I'm going through all my cards, and I'm like, okay, I need something to put in place of Jace, just for tonight, just this one night. I'm still going to run the deck even without the Jaces. No big deal. I want to play the rest of this deck, see how it does. And I come across Augur Bolas, and I'm like, well, it's a 2-mana creature. It can give me some card advantage, and it's a body, so it has synergy with, the Kolaghan's Command and the Cruel Ultimatum returning a creature. So I guess I'll run that. And it's just for one night. It's no big deal. And turns out that 1/3 body is pretty darn relevant. And I also like the effect too. I'll explain about the effect, but first the 1/3 body. It was relevant in a lot of places that I didn't think it would be. Against Infect, you can block and kill their guy if they don't decide to pump. You can block Goblin Guides all day long. You can block things like Dark Confidant's not going to attack you, and no one's going to spend removal on this thing. No one's going to throw a lightning bolt at it unless they're desperate or crazy, or maybe a mix of both. Just no one wants to use removal on this thing. It blocks Snapcaster Mages that your opponent might play. It does a lot. You really wouldn't think so, but it does. Another thing I like about this effect is that it doesn't use the graveyard, and that's one of the other main reasons that this has stayed in the deck as a mainstay. Cards like when your opponent sees Snapcaster Mage and they see Kolaghan's Command returning creatures from the graveyard, they're going to bring in Graveyard Hate. Augur Bolas, not affected by Graveyard Hate. So if I was running Snapcasters or Jaces in there, well, Graveyard Hate kind of shuts down their effects. Stops you from flipping Jace, stops you from using the flashback effects on Snapcaster or Jace. And so the Augurs kind of mitigate that. Also, another thing is the Augurs dig me deeper into my deck. Sometimes, I get an opening hand, I'm like, okay, this is pretty good, but I'm missing like a Terminate. I could use some more creature removal in this. Augur quite frequently helps get you there. It basically anticipates for an instant or sorcery, and there's 29 of them in this deck, so almost half the deck is targetable by Augur. Don't get confused though, there will be times where you whiff on it, and those times are sad, not completely backbreaking unless it happens to you twice in the same game, which that's only happened to me 2 times that I can remember. It was really sad though. And sometimes, you'll play Augur of Bolas, and even if your only card that you can take is like Cruel Ultimatum, just take it. Go for the card advantage. Don't worry if your opponent has knowledge that you're running Cruel Ultimatum. They see Augur of Bolas and Cruel Ultimatum in the early turns. They're just going to think you're crazy. And so just go with it. And Grave Titan is the other thing. No mass removal in the main deck, and that's kind of where Grave Titan comes in. Grave Titan, he can clog up the board, and he kills opponents very, very quickly. It comes out, brings 10 power of creatures on the board when he hits, and so he can swing for 10 on the turn after that. He can wrap up games very quickly. I was very surprised. And Modern doesn't deal well with a resolved Grave Titan. Only thing to really watch out for is Path to Exile on Grave Titan. If it happens, it happens. But you're kind of really sad. If Grave Titan just gets destroyed, well, we have 3 Kolaghan's commands in the main deck, and 2 Cruel Ultimatums that you can bring him back to your hand with, for even more shenanigans. So yeah, that is the main deck, and it's like I said, I've only changed those 2 cards to put the 2 Azet Charms in, and the rest of this deck has been the same from its first iteration. The sideboard, not so much. Sideboard's undergone tons of revisions. The first sideboard I used ran, like, I saw someone running a bunch of like nothing but 1-ofs, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of a neat idea, let me try that out. And that was just awful. Don't do that. I really don't recommend it. So sideboard, you know, I've mentioned before, you've got the standard 2 dispels, you've got 2 things that can mass exile graveyards, a little bit different from Relic of Progenitus. I'll kind of get into that. And I've got 2 Tribute to Hunger. That's the sacrifice deck, or sacrifice card of choice that I've been using in my black-based control decks. Yeah, it's 1 more mana than things like Devour Flesh, but it is still an instant, and you do get to gain life equal to the creature's toughness, which every little bit can help you against burn decks. Burn is probably this deck's worst matchup. Infect, I would say, is this deck's best matchup. In fact, I feel like Infect is basically a buy for me, because everything kills creatures and draws me extra cards, and you just get to a point where you've got Cryptic Command in hand to counter their next creature, and you've got removal for their next 2 creatures after that. Meanwhile, they're spending their turns just trying to top deck another creature because you've run them out. It's great. So, anyways, back to the sideboard. Anger of the Gods. More creature removal. This is the mass creature removal, and I love the exiling effect on Anger of the Gods. We don't have any exiling in the main deck, so things like Voice of Resurgence, Kitchen Finks, you see those kind of cards, bring these in. You see things like Affinity, maybe Merfolk, bring these in. You know, just sweep the board. Elves, good against elves too. We've got Counter Flux. This also comes in against control decks to give you some more counter magic, because we have a lot of creature removal that's probably going to be dead. I mean, some of these cards can function outside of just removing creatures, like Lightning Bolts and Electrolyze, Kolaghan's Command. You do have, some burn spells where you can maybe burn them out. That's not the primary way to finish a match, but it does happen somewhat. So always be looking for that. Terminate is the only thing that just flat out kills a creature and doesn't do anything else, doesn't have any alternate use outside of killing a creature. So that's another interesting thing about the main deck. But yeah, Counterflux, great counter spell, ensures that it can't be countered. The Overload is nice against certain decks like Storm and that. Crumble to Dust there for Tron, obviously. Don't like losing to Tron. And I did mention that this deck kind of loses to Burn. And, I mean, you can reconfigure the sideboard to be better against Burn, or have a better shot against Burn. But ultimately, I find that if Burn is the only matchup that I'm really worried about, I'd say that's a pretty good deck. In fact, I consider this Cruel Ultimatum deck to be one of my trifecta of most successful modern decks. Again, when I mention that, I'm talking about decks that I can just grab and take to the tournament, and pretty much be sure that I can walk away with some sort of prizes. Typically, for the attendance that my local game stores have, the payouts are to like the top 4, and so I can be sure that I can get to the top 4. In fact, I don't remember the last time I took this to a FNM or Tuesday Night Modern and didn't get prizes in some form. So it's very consistent, very strong. I like it. We have some alternate cards, alternate win conditions in the sideboard. We've got Keranos. He comes in against control as well, a little bit better than a Grave Titan that can be removed. And Teferi, if this thing resolves, well, all your counter spells are, you instantly win every counter war. All your opponent's counters are useless, so if you can get that resolved in a control mirror, that's great. Is Teferi really necessary in this list? Probably not. It's probably the one card I would consider a cutting. I just don't know what else I could cut. The only thing I want to fix is burn, and I don't think you can put a one of anything in here and just be like, aha, I have fixed the burn matchup. Doesn't quite work out that way. And then let's get back to the Nihil Spellbomb. So, Nihil Spellbomb, that's a nice mass exile a graveyard. Better than Relic of Progenitus, in my opinion, because, well, we're playing black. So, 1 mana, we can exile a whole graveyard, and if we have black available, which we probably will, we can draw an extra card out of it. And the other nice thing is it only hits our opponent's graveyard. It doesn't hit our graveyard, so it does not affect our ability to use Snapcaster Mage or Kolaghan's Command or any of that sort of stuff. So that's nice. Same with Rakdos Charm. And, people have asked me, why do you run one of each? It seems really weird. At the time, Splinter Twin was still a card in Modern, so the third effect could be used against that potentially. But, destroying an artifact, it gives you another card that destroys an artifact, so that's good against like Affinity or Lantern Control. And sometimes having that exile all cards in a graveyard as an instant rather than a permanent or an artifact that sits on the battlefield, your opponent can see that coming when you're going to do it. They don't really see a Rakdos Charm coming because it's sitting in your hand. So there's a couple distinctions there. So overall, that is my Cruel Ultimatum deck. It's a lot of fun to play. It gets a lot of attention from some of the weird stuff in it. I remember, I'll tell you one more story about this deck. Took this in the fall to a win-a-box tournament in my local game store. $10 to enter. I was like, okay, what deck will I enter? Well, I could build something else, but I've been playing this Cruel Ultimatum deck for like the last 2 to 3 months, and it's been winning very consistently, placing very consistently. I like the deck. I have fun with it. I know the ins and outs of it. I know it'll lose to burn, so I wasn't really expecting to win the tournament or anything. So I'm like, let's just go for it. And round 1 I end up playing against Tron, and I managed to steal game 1. Still not sure how I did that, but I think he got like a really bad hand, and game 2 was obviously, stall with Izzet Charm and Counterflux and Remand until you hit the Cruel Ultimatum, and then it's just really easy to beat Tron from there. Round 2 I ended up playing against Infect, which that was basically a bye. Fun thing against Infect, just kill all their creatures. Kill them at the end of their turn, if you can. Force them to burn their protection spells at very inopportune times, and then if they're able to use their protection spells, save their creature, then just untap and play a kill spell on your turn. You have enough of them. So, strategy for Infect, they're not allowed to have creatures, and that strategy works very well here. And I'd say even against like 50% of the games, I don't even end up getting a poison counter. That's how good this matchup goes for me. And in fact, I'd be as bold to say that Infect only has a shot of beating this deck if they go first, they get a turn 1 Glistener Elf, and I don't have cheap removal to kill it. And to get all those things lined up, it doesn't happen for them too often. And then, like I said, you just get to the mid game where you're holding on to Cryptic and they're trying to top deck another creature, and then you counter that. Then you drop a Grave Titan on them, and then they have no idea how to deal with that because they're infect. They don't plan on going past like turn 3. So Grave Titan just comes out and kills them really quickly. If you're ever wondering whether or not to attack with Grave Titan, the board looks kind of iffy, the answer is always attack with Grave Titan. I haven't really run into a situation where I don't want to attack with the Grave Titan. Maybe if your opponent has a 1/1 Death Touch or something, but even then I might still swing with it because, we have Kolaghan's Command and Cruel Ultimatum to bring it back. So, yeah, very fun deck. Try it out if you like. If you like Control, you like Cruel Ultimatum, you like Modern. Try out this deck. You've got some wacky cards in here, especially with the Augurs and the Coalition Relics. Your opponent won't have a clue what's going on. It'll be great. You'll have a great time. So that's all for this. Now I mentioned that this deck is kind of weak to burn, and a lot of burn decks started to show up. And I remember there was one night that there was like, I don't know, 9 to 10 people there, and 4 to 5 of them had burn, or one of them was like a mono red goblins deck, so it's like 4 or 5 decks of that. There's budget mono red burn, which this deck actually handles the mono red versions of burn fairly well. It's the Naya burn that's basically an auto loss. You can kind of combat the mono red burn. Most mono red burns tend to be more budgety type of decks, and so like they don't have fetches, so you can kind of count on them flooding out as the game goes on and giving you more time, and they don't have things like Boros Charm or Atarga's Command to contend with. So their damage output is also a little bit lower for the mana cost of their cards. So mono red burn is more manageable with this. But anyways, after that night, I got so sick of burn, I'm like, you know what? I'm going home, and I'm going to build an anti-burn control deck. And that's where we're going to be at next time. So I'll see you then.